Hello everyone, tonight I've got 3 special scary stories for all of you. So before that, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Creepy Sinister, and don't forget to comment below and tell me where you're from and what time you're watching. Now get comfortable and let's begin. Story 1. It was the first Monday at the park I spent completely alone. I thought the silence would be peaceful, until I realized it wasn't silence at all. I've lived in Chicago for about 6 years now, and for most of that time I've worked a standard office job in the Loop. My office is only a few blocks away from the lakefront, so I've made it a habit to walk toward the water for my lunch break. It's the only way I can stay sane after sitting in a cubicle under buzzing fluorescent lights for 8 hours a day. There's a specific spot I go to near a small bird sanctuary fence. It's usually quiet, and the view of Lake Michigan helps me clear my head before I have to go back to filing reports. The park is pretty consistent. You see the same joggers, the same dog walkers, and the same retirees feeding the birds. I have a favorite bench that sits right near the path, and I've probably sat on it 500 times. I know every crack in the wood and every bit of chipped green paint on the iron legs, but that Monday, everything felt slightly off the moment I stepped onto the grass. It was about 12:15 p.m. when I reached my usual spot, but my bench was occupied by a group of tourists. I didn't want to be near people, so I kept walking down the path toward the bird sanctuary. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards past my usual spot, there was a brand new bench. It was tucked away in a little nook of grass that I could have sworn was empty on Friday. It was a beautiful bench made of dark, polished wood and heavy black iron. It was facing the lake at a perfect angle, giving a clear view of the water without any trees blocking the way. I remember thinking it was strange that the city had installed it over the weekend. Usually, Chicago's Parks Department takes months to do anything. I walked over to it and looked it over. There was no wet paint sign, no construction debris, and no commemorative plaque on the back. It looked like it had been there for 20 years, yet it was perfectly clean. I sat down, opened my sandwich, and enjoyed the view. The silence was nice, and for a while I felt more relaxed than I had in months. Around 12:45 p.m., I packed up my trash to head back to the office. As I stood up, I noticed something caught in the gap between the wooden slats of the bench. It was a small, crumpled-up receipt. Being a bit of a neat freak, I pulled it out to throw it away. When I smoothed it out, my heart skipped a beat. It was a receipt from the sandwich shop I had just come from. The date at the top was from 2 years ago, but the order was exactly what I had just eaten. A turkey club with no onions and a bottle of sparkling water. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. I tell myself it was just a weird coincidence. I've ordered that same sandwich dozens of times, and maybe someone else with the same taste had sat here years ago. But the receipt looked fresh, not like it had been sitting outside for 2 years. I tucked it into my pocket and walked back to work, feeling a little unsettled. I didn't tell anyone about it because I knew how crazy it sounded. The next day, Tuesday, I went back to the same spot. It was 12:20 p.m. when I arrived. The new bench was still there, sitting exactly where it had been the day before. As I approached it, I saw an older man sitting on the far end of it. He was wearing a vintage-looking windbreaker and reading a newspaper. I hesitated for a second, but it was a public park, so I sat down on the other end. He didn't look up from his paper, but he spoke in a low, raspy voice. "You're 5 minutes late today, Carmen," he said. I froze, my hand halfway inside my lunch bag. I had never seen this man in my life, and I definitely hadn't told him my name. I turned to look at him, my heart pounding against my ribs. He still wasn't looking at me, just staring at the headlines. I asked him how he knew my name, but he didn't answer. He just folded his paper, stood up, and walked toward the lakefront path without looking back. I watched him go, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine despite the humid Chicago air. I looked down at the spot where he had been sitting. On the wooden slat of the bench, someone had carved a set of initials. They were my initials, CD, followed by the date of that current day. The carving looked old, the wood inside the letters weathered and gray. It looked like it had been there for a decade. I didn't stay to eat my lunch that day. I turned around and ran back toward the crowded streets of the Loop. That night I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking about the man and the carving. I tried to convince myself that maybe an old boyfriend had done it, or it was some elaborate prank, but deep down I knew that wasn't it. The way the man said my name felt too familiar, like he had known me for a long time. I decided that I would stay away from that part of the park for a while. I'd just eat lunch at my desk or go to a coffee shop instead. On Wednesday I tried to stay in the office, but by 1 p.m. I was getting a massive headache. I needed fresh air. I told myself I would go to the park, but I would stay near the main fountain, far away from the bird sanctuary. As I walked along the lakefront, the wind started to pick up. The waves were crashing against the concrete barriers, spraying mist into the air. I found a spot on a concrete ledge and sat down, trying to relax. I looked down at my feet and noticed something half buried in the dirt near the ledge. It was a small, silver keychain with a tiny flashlight attached to it. I picked it up and felt a wave of nausea hit me. I had lost that exact keychain 3 years ago while hiking in Colorado. I remember being so upset because it was a gift from my father. There was no way it could be here in the middle of Chicago years later. I gripped it so hard the metal dug into my palm. I looked up and realized I wasn't near the fountain anymore. Somehow, without realizing it, I had walked much further down the path than I intended. I was standing right in front of the bird sanctuary fence, and there, sitting under the trees, was the bench. It wasn't where it was on Monday. It had moved closer to the fence, almost as if it were following my usual walking route. My heart was racing now, and I felt like I was being watched from the trees. I started to walk away fast, but a woman walking a golden retriever stopped me. She smiled at me like we were old friends. "Oh, Carmen, I was wondering when I'd see you. You haven't been by the bird sanctuary in ages," she said. I stared at her, my mouth dry. I didn't recognize her at all, but her dog was jumping up on me as if it knew me. She mentioned a conversation we supposedly had last summer about the local piping plovers. I have never talked to anyone about birds in my life. I mumbled something about being in a hurry and pushed past her. The park felt different now. The sounds of the city, the distant sirens, the hum of traffic on Lake Shore Drive seemed to be fading away. It was getting quieter and quieter, even though it was the middle of the day. I reached the edge of the park and practically dove into a taxi. I told the driver to take me anywhere else, and I didn't go back to the office for the rest of the afternoon. I spent the evening searching the internet for anything about the park or the bench. I looked through old archives of Chicago news, looking for reports of weird occurrences or missing persons. I found an old forum post from the early 2000s where someone mentioned a disappearing bench in Lincoln Park, but the thread was dead and had no photos. Most people just laughed it off as an urban legend, but I knew what I was seeing wasn't a legend. By Thursday, I was exhausted. I decided I needed to face whatever was happening. I went to the park early, around 11 a.m. before the lunch rush started. I walked straight to the bird sanctuary. The bench was there again, but this time it was right in the middle of the path, blocking the way. It looked even older now. The wood was cracked and moss was growing over the iron legs. It looked like it had been sitting in a damp forest for 50 years. I walked up to it, my hands shaking. Resting on the seat of the bench was an old, leather-bound journal. I recognized it immediately. It was the diary I had kept when I was 16 years old. I hadn't seen it since I moved out of my parents' house in Michigan. I opened it to a random page, and the handwriting was definitely mine, but the entries weren't from my childhood. They were entries about this week. They described everything I had felt and done since Monday. The last entry was dated for today, Thursday, at 11:15 a.m. It said, "I'm standing at the bench now. I can't hear the city anymore. I think I'm going to sit down one last time." I looked at my watch. It was exactly 11:15 a.m. The silence was absolute now. I couldn't hear the wind, the waves, or the birds in the sanctuary. It felt like the entire world had been vacuum sealed. I looked toward the lake, and the water was as still as glass. I turned around to run, but the path behind me was gone. Where the concrete path had been, there was now just thick, overgrown grass and dense trees. The bird sanctuary fence was tall and rusted, and it seemed to stretch on forever in both directions. I was trapped in a small clearing with the bench. I felt a heavy weight in my chest, a feeling of being remembered by something that didn't have a soul. The park didn't just know me, it was absorbing me. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The screen just showed a blurry image of the bench as the wallpaper. I had never set that as my background. I started to scream, but the sound didn't seem to travel. It was like screaming into a pillow. I felt a hand on my shoulder and whirled around. It was the man from Tuesday. He wasn't holding a newspaper anymore. He was holding a park ranger's hat, and he looked incredibly sad. "You've been sitting here a long time, Carmen," he whispered. "The bench has been waiting for you to finish your lunch." I looked at the bench again, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a Polaroid photo tucked into the frame of the backrest. It showed me sitting on the bench, but I looked much older. My hair was gray, and my clothes were tattered. I was smiling at the camera, but my eyes were completely blank. I didn't stay to hear anything else. I turned and sprinted into the trees, ignoring the branches that scratched my face and the roots that tripped me. I ran until my lungs burned and my vision went blurry. I didn't look back once. Eventually, the sound of a distant siren broke through the silence. I burst through a thicket of bushes and tumbled onto the sidewalk of a busy street. People were walking by, looking at me like I was a crazy person. I was covered in dirt and leaves. I checked my watch. It was 4:30 p.m. I had been in the park for over 5 hours, but to me, it felt like 20 minutes. I took the first bus I saw and went straight home. I locked every door and window in my apartment. I didn't go to work on Friday. I called in sick and spent the day packing my things. I knew I couldn't stay in Chicago anymore. Every time I looked out the window, I expected to see that dark wood and iron sitting on the sidewalk. I moved to a small town in Arizona 2 weeks later. I thought the desert would be safe, no parks, no benches, just sand and rock. For a few months, things were normal. I started a new job and tried to forget about the lakefront. But last night, I was walking from my car to my front door. The sun was setting and the air was finally cooling down. I noticed something in the empty lot across the street from my house. It was a small patch of green grass, perfectly manicured, sitting in the middle of the dry dirt. and right in the center of that grass was a bench made of dark, polished wood and heavy black iron. It was facing my house, and there was a small, white bag sitting on the seat. I didn't go over to check, but I knew what was inside. It was a turkey club sandwich with no onions and a bottle of sparkling water. The park hasn't forgotten me, and I don't think it ever will. Story 2. Back in Plano, Texas, I worked the night shift at a gas station. I used to think the scariest thing I'd see was a drunk customer. I was wrong. That job taught me a lot about being alert, but it didn't prepare me for the absolute dread I felt a few months later. After I left the gas station, I took a job at a local community recreation center. It was a pretty standard suburban setup, right on the edge of a large public park with walking trails and a massive playground. I usually worked the closing shift, which meant I was the one responsible for making sure every door was locked and every light was turned off. The rec center was a massive, echoing building with polished wooden gym floors and long, dimly lit hallways. At night, when the crowds of kids and elderly exercise groups were gone, the place felt completely different. Every footstep I took on those basketball courts seemed to echo 10 times louder than it should have. I never liked being there alone, but the pay was decent for a college student, so I didn't complain much. I had a routine down where I could finish the closing checklist in about 45 minutes if I moved quickly. It was a Tuesday night in October, around 10:30 p.m., when I finally finished locking the heavy glass front doors. Usually I would walk straight to my car in the main parking lot, but that night the lot was being repaved. I had to park my old sedan on the far side of the park, near the residential neighborhood. To get there, I had to cut through the park and pass directly by the playground. The Texas heat had finally started to break, leaving the air cool and slightly damp with a thick, low-hanging mist. The park was incredibly dark at that hour, save for a few flickering orange streetlights along the perimeter. As I stepped off the concrete sidewalk and onto the grass, the sound of my own breathing felt heavy in the quiet air. I've lived in Plano most of my life, and I always considered it a safe, boring suburb. You don't really expect anything bad to happen in a place where the biggest news is usually a high school football game. But as I walked deeper into the park, that sense of security started to fade into a strange, prickly feeling on the back of my neck. I reached the edge of the playground around 10:40 p.m. It was one of those modern playgrounds with high plastic towers, winding slides, and a large section of wood chips. In the daylight, it was a bright, happy place filled with the sounds of laughing children and parents chatting on benches. In the dark, however, the equipment looked like a collection of strange, twisted silhouettes. The swings were perfectly still, their metal chains hanging limp in the stagnant air. I kept my head down, focusing on the path ahead of me, wanting nothing more than to reach my car and go home. That was when I heard it. A small, high-pitched voice drifted through the air, sounding like it came from the center of the playground. It wasn't a scream or a cry for help, it was just a quiet, melodic sound. I stopped in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat as I strained my ears to listen. I thought maybe a teenager was hanging out late, or perhaps a parent had stayed way past closing time with a toddler, but as I looked around, I didn't see any movement at all. I stood there for a moment, wondering if I should just keep walking. Then the voice spoke again, much clearer this time. It didn't just make a sound, it spoke two distinct words. It said my full name, Darius Miller. My stomach dropped instantly, and a cold shiver ran down my entire spine. There was no reason for anyone to be out here, let alone someone who knew exactly who I was. The voice sounded like a young child, maybe 6 or 7 years old, but there was something off about the tone. It was too flat, too perfect, like a recording being played back at a slightly lower speed. I scanned the playground equipment again, my eyes darting between the plastic slides and the crawl-through tunnels. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. I hated how high and nervous I sounded in the middle of the empty park. I waited for a response, half expecting a friend to jump out and tell me it was all a stupid prank. But nobody jumped out, and the silence that followed was even heavier than before. I took a few steps closer to the wood chips, driven by a mix of fear and a weird sense of responsibility. If there really was a kid lost out here at nearly 11 p.m., I couldn't just leave them. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the structures. The light reflected off the bright yellow plastic and the metal poles, but it didn't reveal a soul. The playground was completely, hauntingly empty. I felt a surge of adrenaline, the kind that tells your brain to run as fast as you can in the opposite direction. Just as I turned to leave, the voice came again. This time it wasn't coming from the center of the playground. It sounded like it was standing right behind the nearest slide, barely 10 feet away from me. "Darius," it whispered. It was my name again, but the voice had changed. It no longer sounded like a child. It sounded exactly like me. It was my own voice, with my own inflection and my own Texas accent being thrown back at me from the darkness. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I pointed it toward the base of the slide. There was nothing there but the shadow of the ladder. My mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation for what I was hearing. Maybe it was an echo, but the park was too open for an echo like that, and an echo doesn't change the pitch of a voice to mimic the person listening. I felt a wave of nausea hit me as the realization set in that I was being hunted by something that wasn't right. I didn't say another word. I turned and started walking toward my car, but I didn't run yet. I didn't want to give whatever was out there the satisfaction of knowing I was terrified. I could hear the sound of wood chips crunching behind me, rhythmic and steady. Every time I stepped, I heard an extra footfall a split second later. It was as if something was tailing me, perfectly matching my pace, staying just outside the reach of my flashlight beam. I reached the edge of the wood chips and stepped onto the grass, picking up my pace. My car was only about 50 yards away now, sitting under a lonely street lamp near the residential street. I pulled my keys out of my pocket, my fingers fumbling with the remote. As I hurried across the lawn, I heard the voice one last time. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a loud, clear shout that sounded like it was coming from right next to my ear. Darius, wait. The sheer volume of it made me jump, and I finally broke into a full sprint. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what was standing behind me or what kind of face was making that sound. I reached my car, slammed the unlock button, and dove into the driver's seat. I locked the doors immediately, my chest heaving as I struggled to get the key into the ignition. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the keys on the floor mat. Once the engine roared to life, I finally looked out the window. The park was still shrouded in mist, and the playground was visible in the distance. Under the faint light of the distant street lamp, I saw a figure standing on top of the highest play structure. It wasn't a child, and it didn't look like a person. It was a tall, thin shape standing perfectly still, watching my car. It didn't have any discernible features in the dark, just a dark silhouette against the gray sky. I shifted the car into drive and sped away, not caring about the speed limit or the quiet neighborhood streets. I didn't stop until I was at a well-lit gas station a few miles away. I sat there in the parking lot for a long time, the bright fluorescent lights feeling like a shield against the darkness I had just left. I tried to tell myself I had imagined it, that the stress of the night shift was getting to me, but I knew what I heard. You don't forget the sound of your own voice calling out to you from a place where you're supposed to be alone. The next day I went back to the rec center during the afternoon. I told my manager that I couldn't work the closing shifts anymore, making up some excuse about my classes. He looked at me like I was crazy, but he eventually agreed to move me to the morning shift. While I was there, I walked back out to the playground just to see it in the daylight. It looked so normal, so innocent. I walked over to the slide where I had heard the voice, looking for any signs of someone having been there. In the wood chips at the base of the slide, I found something that made my blood run cold all over again. There were no footprints from a child or a teenager. Instead, there were deep, narrow indentations in the mulch, like someone had been standing there on stilts or very thin poles. And resting on the bottom step of the ladder was a small, handwritten note on a piece of yellow legal paper. It only had one thing written on it, my home address. I quit the job that same afternoon. I didn't even wait for my final paycheck to be processed. I moved out of my apartment in Plano a week later, staying with a friend in North Dallas until I could find a new place. I never went back to that park, and I never found out who or what was on that playground that night. Sometimes, when I'm at home and the house is quiet, I think I hear a faint whisper of my name coming from the hallway. I try to tell myself it's just the wind or the house settling, but deep down I know better. Whatever was in that park didn't just know my name, it knew where I lived, and the scariest part isn't that it found me once. The scariest part is the thought that it might still be out there, practicing my voice, waiting for the next time I'm alone in the dark. I still don't like silence, because in the silence, you can hear things you were never meant to hear. Story 3. This happened during a solo hiking trip to Palo Duro Canyon. Everyone was afraid of what was outside, but my fear came from inside my own house. I know that sounds strange, considering I was miles away from any neighborhood, but the feeling of being watched had followed me from my bedroom all the way to the dusty trails of West Texas. It was late August, and I had just gone through a pretty messy breakup that left me feeling like a stranger in my own apartment. Every creak in the floorboards made me jump, and I couldn't shake the idea that someone was looking through my windows at night. I figured a weekend of hiking and camping in the Grand Canyon of Texas would be the reset I needed to clear my head and get over my paranoia. I pulled into the Palo Duro Canyon State Park entrance around 5:15 p.m. on a Friday. The heat was still hovering in the mid-90s, and the air had that dry, heavy stillness that you only find in the Panhandle. I paid my entrance fee at the gate and started the long drive down into the canyon floor. If you've never been there, the road is steep and winds around sharp curves that reveal massive red rock formations and deep orange cliffs. It's beautiful, but it's also incredibly isolating once you get down into the basin. By the time I reached the trailhead parking loop for the Lighthouse Trail, there were only 2 other cars left in the lot. I sat in my car for a few minutes with the air conditioning blasting, trying to psych myself up for the hike. My plan was to do a quick 3-mile loop before sunset and then head to my reserved campsite to set up my tent. I checked my bag one last time to make sure I had enough water, my headlamp, and my pocket knife. The sun was starting to dip toward the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the red clay earth. It was exactly the kind of peace I thought I wanted, but as I stepped out of the car, that familiar heavy feeling in my chest returned. It felt like eyes were on the back of my neck from the moment my boots hit the gravel. As I was locking my car door, a park ranger stepped out from behind a large cedar tree near the trailhead map. He didn't startle me exactly, but I hadn't noticed him standing there when I pulled in. He was wearing the standard tan Stetson hat and the gray-green uniform you see on most state park employees. He looked to be in his late 40s, with a very neatly trimmed beard and a name tag that read Miller. He was leaning against a wooden post, smiling in a way that seemed friendly enough, but his eyes were hidden behind dark aviator sunglasses. I gave him a polite nod as I adjusted my backpack straps. The ranger didn't move from his spot, but he spoke up in a very calm, professional voice. He asked me if I was planning on heading out on the trail this late in the evening. I told him I was just doing a short loop and that I had plenty of water and a light. He nodded slowly, his smile never really wavering or changing shape. Then he shifted his weight and asked me if I'd seen anyone missing near the parking loop. I remember thinking that was a very strange way to word the question. Usually they ask if you've seen a specific person or describe an outfit, but he just used the word missing as if it were a category of person. I told him I hadn't seen anyone else since I passed the visitor center near the rim of the canyon. He just stared at me for a few seconds too long, his reflection in the sunglasses making it impossible to see where he was actually looking. He then asked me again, using the exact same tone, if I was sure I hadn't seen anyone missing near the brush. I felt a small prickle of unease in my stomach, but I brushed it off as me just being on edge from my recent stress. I told him again that I was alone and hadn't seen a soul. He finally stepped aside and told me to have a safe hike, watching me as I walked past the trailhead marker and onto the dirt path. The first 10 minutes of the hike were actually quite nice, and I started to relax into the rhythm of the trail. The sounds of the desert were starting to come alive as the temperature dropped a few degrees. I could hear the rustle of lizards in the scrub brush and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. The trail wound through some high walls of red silt and stone, occasionally opening up into wide vistas of the canyon floor. I kept checking my watch, making sure I was making good time. It was about 5:40 p.m. when I reached a small fork in the trail that led toward a scenic overlook. I decided to take the short detour to get a photo of the sunset hitting the canyon walls. As I climbed the small incline toward the overlook, I noticed how silent the air had become. The wind had died down completely, and even the insects seemed to have gone quiet. I reached the top of the ridge and looked down at the trail below. That's when I saw the ranger again. He was standing about 50 yards away, right in the middle of the path I had just walked. He was perfectly still, facing the direction I was heading, his hands folded neatly behind his back. I felt a sudden jolt of confusion. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me unless he had sprinted through the dense brush, which didn't make any sense. He was also standing in a spot that was quite a distance from the trailhead where I had just left him. I figured there must be another ranger who looked similar, or maybe he had a utility vehicle hidden nearby that I hadn't seen. I watched him for a moment, waiting for him to move, but he remained as still as a statue. He looked exactly like the man I had spoken to 10 minutes ago, right down to the specific way his hat sat on his head. I decided to head back down to the main trail, feeling a bit awkward about staring at him from the ridge. As I approached him, he turned his head toward me with a slow, mechanical motion. The same smile was etched onto his face, looking almost like a mask in the fading orange light. Before I could even say hello or ask how he beat me down there, he spoke. He asked me if I'd seen anyone missing near the parking loop. My heart skipped a beat because it wasn't just the same question. It was the exact same inflection, the same pause, and the same unsettling tone he had used at the trailhead. I came to a halt about 10 feet away from him, my hand instinctively gripping the strap of my bag. I told him a bit more firmly this time that we had just talked about this back at my car. I told him my name was Martinez and that I was the one who just pulled in 10 minutes ago. He didn't acknowledge anything I said. He didn't blink and he didn't look surprised. He just stood there, staring through those dark glasses, and repeated the question for a third time. He asked if I had seen anyone missing near the brush, and this time he pointed a finger toward a cluster of mesquite trees off to the side of the trail. The way he pointed was unnatural, his arm stiff and his fingers splayed out in a way that looked painful. I looked over at the trees he was pointing to, but there was nothing there but shadows and dry grass. When I looked back at him, he had stepped a few inches closer to me without making a sound on the gravel. I could see the name tag on his chest again. It definitely said Miller. But as I looked closer, I noticed something that made the hair on my arms stand up. His uniform was perfectly clean, but his hands were covered in a thick, dark red mud that looked almost like dried blood. I didn't want to stick around to find out if it was mud or something else. I felt a wave of pure cold adrenaline hit my system. I gave a quick nervous nod and said I had to get going before it got too dark. I didn't wait for him to respond. I turned around and started walking back the way I came, toward the parking lot. I wasn't going to finish my loop, and I certainly wasn't going to stay at that campsite. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get back to my car as fast as possible. I kept my pace fast, almost a jog, listening intently for the sound of boots behind me. I didn't hear any footsteps, which somehow made it worse. The silence of the canyon felt heavy and suffocating now. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see that tan Stetson hat emerging from the shadows of the red rocks. The sun had finally dipped below the horizon, leaving the canyon in a deep purple twilight. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, and the red dust was starting to coat the back of my throat. I finally saw the wooden trailhead sign ahead of me, and beyond it, the silhouette of my silver SUV sitting alone in the parking loop. I practically ran the last 50 yards to my car, fumbling with my keys in my pocket. I reached the driver's side door and pressed the unlock button, the beep of the car sounding like a gunshot in the quiet air. Just as I was about to pull the handle, I looked toward the trailhead map where I had first seen the ranger. There was someone standing there again. It was another ranger, but this one looked different. He was older, thinner, and he looked exhausted. He was holding a heavy-duty flashlight and was talking into a radio on his shoulder. He saw me and immediately started walking over, his flashlight beam bouncing across the gravel. He asked me if I was okay and why I was in such a hurry. I was shaking pretty badly by this point, and I told him about the other ranger, Miller, and how he had been acting extremely strange on the trail. I told him about the repeated questions and the mud on his hands. The older ranger stopped walking and looked at me with a very confused and concerned expression. He asked me to repeat the name on the name tag, and I told him again that it was Miller. The older ranger sighed and rubbed his face, looking genuinely unsettled. He told me that there was a Ranger Miller who worked at Palo Duro, but he wasn't on duty today. In fact, Ranger Miller had been missing since 6 a.m. that morning after he went out to check on a reported brush fire near the back of the canyon. They had found his patrol vehicle abandoned 3 miles away, but they hadn't found him. The ranger I was talking to now told me he was part of the search party and that they were actually looking for Miller right now. He asked me exactly where I had seen the man. I pointed back toward the ridge where I had seen the second encounter, my voice trembling as I described the man's stiff movements and the way he kept asking about missing people. The older ranger's face went pale. He told me to get in my car, lock the doors, and drive straight to the park exit without stopping. He said he was going to call it in and get more officers down to that trailhead immediately. I didn't need to be told twice. I jumped into my SUV, locked the doors, and peeled out of the parking lot, my tires spitting gravel into the night air. The drive out of the canyon felt like it took hours. Every time my headlights hit a sign or a tree, I expected to see that smiling man standing in the road, pointing toward the brush. I didn't stop at the gate, I just kept driving until I hit the main highway back toward Amarillo. I stayed in a well-lit hotel that night, pushing a heavy chair in front of the door and keeping every light in the room turned on. I couldn't stop thinking about the way that man had looked at me, and the way his voice sounded so empty, like a recording being played back at the wrong speed. I called the park office the next morning to follow up on what happened. The person on the phone was very quiet and told me they couldn't give out much information, but they confirmed that they had found something near the trailhead where I was hiking. They didn't find Ranger Miller alive. They found his uniform and his gear neatly piled under a mesquite tree, but the man himself was still gone. There were no signs of a struggle and no tracks leading away from the pile of clothes. It was as if he had simply stepped out of his skin and vanished into the canyon walls. The part that still keeps me awake at night isn't just the thought of what happened to the real Ranger Miller. It's the realization of what that thing on the trail was actually doing. It wasn't just a doppelganger or a person in a costume. It was something that didn't understand how humans work, trying its best to mimic an authority figure to keep me in place. When it asked me if I had seen anyone missing, it wasn't looking for a hiker. It was looking for a replacement. Sometimes when I'm sitting in my house at night, I hear a faint tapping on the glass, and I wonder if it finally followed me home.